Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Thanks for joining us today on the Dairy News and Views from the Iowa State University Dairy Team. I'm Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and today I'm here with Extension Dairy Team colleague Gail Carpenter, who is a State Extension Dairy Specialist, as we discuss mitigating heat stress for our employees. Welcome back to the podcast, Gail.
Happy to be here, Fred.
Very good. Today we're joined on the podcast with Cody Volkmann, Occupational Safety Specialist with Iowa State University Environmental Health and Safety Group. Welcome to our podcast, Cody. And before we get into the topic, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you, Fred. Well, first off, thank you to you and your team for inviting me onto this podcast to discuss heat stress and prevention for employees. A little bit about myself. Grew up in Northwest Iowa, actually just a couple miles from a small family farm dairy. So pretty familiar with those operations. And after I graduated high school, went to Iowa State. I received my bachelor's degree in industrial systems technology and ag systems technology. After that, I spent a number of years traveling around the Midwest with a service company providing maintenance to all kinds of biofuel facilities, ethanol plants, biodiesel, petrochemicals, etc. And then I found myself at Iowa State as an occupational safety specialist. And growing up on the farm and being a safety professional, Iowa State allows me to merge those two passions into one. So here I am today.
Very good. Let's start off by defining heat stress and what are some of the heat-related illnesses that are part of that complex?
Yeah, great question. So when we look at heat stress, the technical definition of it is the net heat load of heat exposure from the combined contributions of the metabolic rate, which you can think of as how much heat is generated while you're working, environmental factors, and then also the heat loss from a person's body to the environment. And we can talk about more of those contributing factors here in a little bit that make up that definition. And I like to think of it as inputs and outputs, and we'll take that stance as we move forward. And when you hear heat stress, some of the most common heat-related illnesses you may hear are heat rash, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. And heat stroke can even be broken down even further into classical or exertional heat stress or heat stroke. And in the work environment, a large majority of the heat strokes are what are called exertional heat strokes, which means the person is working so hard, they're exerting so much energy that the generation of body heat overcomes the body's ability to naturally cool itself. And on the webinar, it was asked about sunburn, and sunburn is a heat-related illness due to your exposure to the sun's harmful rays in a warm environment.
So does that then contribute in any other way to a worker who is in a hot environment?
Yeah, if we're referring to sunburn, once a person gets a sunburn, which myself, I've had a sunburn, anybody that's probably worked outside has had a sunburn before. Once you get a sunburn, it makes you very uncomfortable, and it can prohibit people from taking the proper precautions to properly protect themselves when they do get a sunburn. One of the best things you can do is to cover up a sunburn. But as you may realize, if you've ever had one, once you get a sunburn, covering up a sunburn is often very painful and very uncomfortable. So once you get a sunburn, until it's fully healed, it's just very difficult to be comfortable and to take the appropriate precautions to protect yourself from further sunburn during that time period. And so, yeah, sunburn is a heat-related illness that it's very easy to obtain.
What are some other contributing factors to some of these heat-related diseases?
Yeah, so when we look at contributing factors to heat stress, I like to look at it as inputs and outputs of heat stress. And we have two inputs. Number one being the metabolic rate, or how much heat an employee is generated from working. Two is how much heat gain a person gains from the environment. Typically, that's from ambient temperature combined with the effects of humidity. And lastly, we have the output, which is our heat loss to the environment. Our body has natural physiological processes that when we start to become stressed and our body strained, it starts to try to cool itself off. And typically that is done by sending your blood from your core to all the capillaries in your body close to your skin. That's why people often turn red in warm environments. So that way it creates larger surface area for the blood to try to cool down your core temperature. Along with that, you have evaporative cooling from sweat. So when you start to get warm, your body starts sweating. So that way it can cool yourself by pulling heat away from your skin, which all that surface area and all the bloodless capillaries, it's cooling that blood off to return to your core to try to keep your body cool. And then it's just that cycle that keeps going to try to cool your body off. So when we look at this, anything a person can do to positively impact the heat gain from working, the local conditions or environment, or how you can improve the heat loss from the body to the environment. If you can think of any way to positively impact any one of those contributing factors, you can help reduce the net heat load on your employees.
The way you talked about that in the webinar, it was almost like it's an equation. You have inputs, positives and minuses. It was really interesting and made a lot of sense. One of the things you talked about was, you know, getting into an environment that you could cool down in. And I remember grandma blaming air conditioning, for a lot of bad things. Does moving in and out of air conditioning contribute to heat stress?
Excellent question. So it used to be thought that people that work outside for long periods of time and then go home at the end of the day to air conditioning, they were not able to properly acclimatize. And research has shown that not to be true. As long as a person is exposed to a hot or cold environment, this also applies to working in cold weather. As long as you're exposed to that environment for a minimum of 1 hour repeatedly, your body will begin the process to acclimatize to that environment. So if you're exposed to a hot environment at least 1 hour from anywhere from 7 to 21 days, your body will naturally start to acclimatize to that environment. The acclimatization time for each person is a little bit different due to personal factors. But as long as you're in that environment for an hour, your body will start to acclimatize to that environment. That's why, let's use an example temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit. In October, to us, 40 degrees Fahrenheit feels pretty chilly because our bodies are used to all the warm temperatures during summer and fall. However, if we fast forward to March and it's 40 degrees outside, even though it's still 40 degrees, it feels pretty warm to us because we're used to all those cold temperatures. So even if you don't work outside, going inside to outside and just being in the cold environments, your body will naturally acclimatize to those environments.
Is there another factor there? I mean, everybody who knows me knows I'm not a very wispy kind of a man. I'm older, I'm heavy. Do heavy people have more trouble with this acclimation than younger, lighter people?
So typically younger children and older adults have a little more difficulty acclimatizing because they're not able to thermoregulate as well as a average adult. And then there's also personal factors that may tie into that as well. For instance, some medications do not allow people to thermoregulate, or that medication may interrupt the ability to sweat. For instance, as simple as a antihistamine for allergy medication, in some individuals, just taking that allergy medication, to them, it prohibits or inhibits their ability to sweat. So depending on those personal factors, yes, it can definitely impact a person's ability to acclimatize to the environment.
One of the things you talked about in the webinar was this idea of wet bulb globe temperature. Can you explain that a little bit more, and what makes that different from heat index?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of regulatory agencies, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, American Conference of General and Industrial Hygienists. Some people may be familiar with the International Standards Organization, also known as ISO. Those organizations have identified the wet bulb globe temperature as the primary way to measure heat stress in the work environment. And a lot of people may be familiar with the heat index. The heat index is a lot more common. We see it on the news. We see it on our weather apps. If you pull up your weather app, you'll see temperature outside maybe 85 degrees, but then you'll see that feels like temperature, where that might be 95 or 100, even though the ambient temperature isn't that temperature outside. So I'd like to talk about, to show the difference, I'd like to talk about the difference between the heat index and the wet bulb globe temperature. So when we look at the heat index is that what it feels like temperature outside when we combine the effect of the ambient temperature with the humidity. And when we take heat index readings, those readings are taken in the shade. Now, when we talk about this wet bulb globe temperature reading, that reading is taken in the direct sunlight, and it has more criteria factored into that calculation, where the heat index factors in ambient temperature and humidity. The wet bulb globe temperature factors in temperature, humidity, but also wind speed and the solar irradiance, which is essentially how much energy can a person absorb from the sun during that time period. And wet bulb globe temperature is not as common right now just because it's relatively newer, but it's not as commonly communicated because the heat index has been around for a while, and that's what people are used to seeing on the news. You get heat alerts on your phone. All of that is presented in the heat index. And so OSHA is in the process of finalizing a heat-related illness prevention standard, and they have not determined whether they're going to use the heat index, wet bulb globe temperature, or both. But the wet bulb globe temperature is something we're going to be seeing quite a bit more in the future as we move forward. And I recently had a conversation with our National Weather Service local office, and they're aware of this wet bulb globe temperature pretty intricately, and they're actually going to start to try to incorporating those values into some of their postings and posters and social media posts. There's no timeline for that, but it's here, and more information about the wet bulb globe temperature is going to be coming more readily available. We're just not quite there yet. So it's definitely something you want to be aware of. And it's just a different index compared to the heat index. So a little bit different. And they both do serve the same purpose of quote, what it feels like temperature, but the values at the end of the calculation are different just from the different criteria that goes into taking those readings.
For our listeners, we had presented a resource where employers can find the wet bulb globe temperature, and we'll be sure and include that there on the website when we archive this information. One of the questions we had was, we've always heard that wear a light colored shirt in the summertime to reflect the heat. What kind of difference is there between white and black clothing during the summer heat?
Yeah, so there's been research going both ways on this, where it says you need to wear lighter colored clothing because the lighter colored clothing will reflect more of the sun rays. Therefore, your clothing does not absorb that. Therefore, it keeps your body cooler. There's also been some studies out there that have said that yes, wearing a darker colored shirt or clothing, yes, those clothes are going to absorb more of that energy, but by the time that heat is transferred to your body, it's negligible compared to light colored clothing. I haven't seen a whole lot of conclusivity regarding the wearing the darker color is not much different than wearing lighter colored. If you look at a lot of the recommendations and a lot of the communications that go out, the recommendation is still to wear light colored clothing to help reflect that energy away. But not only light colored, one of the best ways you could prevent sunburn is to wear long sleeve shirts, longer pants, and even a hat to prevent some of the, or to provide some shade around your head, shoulder, neck area. And so, of course, you don't want to wear baggy clothing, especially if you're working on the dairy farm around PTOs, rotating equipment, etc. But you definitely want to at least wear some of those longer clothes and pants to prevent the sun rays if you're going to be working in the sunlight. If you're in a shaded building, you might not be having that exposure to those UV rays, but lightweight, long sleeve pants and a hat are good ways to prevent absorbing those UV rays to prevent sunburn, which is a heat-related illness.
What are some other solutions that we can be using to prevent heat stress?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first started, we talked about exertional heat stroke, and the main cause of exertional heat stroke is from workers working really hard, really fast, and that's workload intensity. So one of the best ways we can reduce the total heat stress on our workers is by identifying ways we can reduce the physical demands of the work and reduce the amount of movements our employees need to take while still maintaining efficiency and being able to perform the work. Some examples of this is instead of carrying bales or buckets of feed by hand, use a tractor or a skid steer, some mechanical way to do that work for us. Maybe even robotic milking systems, or even just parlor design can help make that more efficient and reduce the amount of work people have to do. So workload management is definitely one of the preferred ways to be able to reduce the heat stress on employees. Not saying you have to stop your employees from working, but just are there ways you can change the processes or procedures to reduce the workload to them? Another thing you can do or think about is there any way you can improve the local environment or conditions of where your employees are working? And controlling the local environment can be more difficult depending on whether you're working inside versus outside, and whether if you're working in a fixed location or a mobile location. So if there's any way, if you're working outside, can you put up a small portable tent working in the shade if it's fixed? If it's mobile outside, that's much more challenging. And so you really need to look at that workload management. But if you're in an indoor facility, can you improve the airflow? Can you reduce the ambient temperature with air conditioning or something similar? That may not be feasible in large animal production facilities all the time, but are there ways you can just improve those conditions or provide shade? And lastly, one of the best ways to keep people from heat stress is providing hydration stations. Are they properly hydrating? Allowing people to have access to cool potable water or sports drinks with electrolyte is one way how you can help ensure they're staying hydrated, because if somebody becomes dehydrated, they're not going to be able to properly cool themselves down by sweating. So if we can manage the workload, try to positively impact the local environment, And then if we can help people stay cool by providing hydration stations, maybe even providing some chilling PPE. They have these really nice cooling towels now where you get them moist and damp, and then you wring them out and you can put them on your neck or on your head, and that helps cool your body off by providing a larger surface area to cool your body off. Uh, the other thing to think about is in your dairy barns, your parlors, you already have some heat stress mitigation put in place for your cattle and your herds. Think if there's any way of how you could adapt those, or if they're already being used to improve the conditions for your employees working in those facilities.
We've really focused our discussion on what is heat stress and what are solutions to prevent heat stress. Let's shift now and talk about what are some steps employers can do to train their employees about how to not get in trouble with heat stress.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, Education is key here. And one of the best things you can do is you need to train your employees on heat stress, what heat stress is, and the related symptoms and how to respond to those symptoms. So they should be trained on what the different types of heat-related illnesses are, the signs and symptoms associated with those heat-related illness, but also they need to be trained on first aid procedures if they start to notice or feel some of those effects. And then also emergency procedures if somebody is exhibiting some of those classic symptoms of heat exhaustion or even a heat stroke. And along with that, you need to train them on what are personal factors and how their personal factors and decisions can affect their body in the heat. And combining all that training, it gives them the knowledge to be able to identify and recognize and respond to those heat-related illnesses. But as we're talked here, it's also good to train them on how can they mitigate the heat stress to them in their work environment. And we didn't talk about this on the webinar, but one of the things we mentioned a lot was how can you reduce the workload? Well, talk to your employees and see if they have ideas of how they can be more efficient or how they can improve the job process. Oftentimes they have a lot of great ideas. So tap into that as a resource as well of how you can prevent heat stress for your employees.
Anything else you think our listeners should know? Any final takeaways when it comes to heat stress mitigation for farm employees?
Yeah, so heat stress is not going away anytime soon. In the past few years, we have seen as a whole in the United States, just not work, but personal lives, vacations, things like that, etc. We have seen a drastic increase in injuries and death from severe heat. National Weather Service statistic was that in 2023, it's estimated that there were 2,300 people that died in the United States from extreme heat. And that is more than tornadoes, hurricanes, and floods combined. So this is an important topic. We're going to be seeing a lot more heat stress and what it means for us, especially with OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, getting ready to publish their first heat-related illness standard at the federal level. We're going to be seeing heat stress become more and more prevalent in the work environment and requirements on how we can reduce the heat stress to our employees. And I know we talked about the work environment a lot, but the concept of heat stress, your inputs and outputs, this also applies to you working at home as well. So you can apply those same principles for yourself, your family, as you're outside doing things during the summer as well.
Well, Cody, thank you very much. We appreciate the information you brought to us today. And we have this podcast on our website, or will in the next few days, as well as some of the resource material that we talked about today and referenced there during the webinar. Folks, thank you for joining us today, and Look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from Iowa State.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.